I'm Brenda Daly, Director of the Center for Excellence in the Arts and Humanities. And on behalf of the Center, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We are both honoring our distinguished scholar tonight, and we'll introduce him in a few moments. At the same time, we're launching our fall series, The Book of Life in a Genomic Age. And I'm going to take a few moments to explain how we came up with that title. But first, I have quite a few people to thank. Max Rothschild and Amy Bix, if you would come up here for just a moment. Max Rothschild is Distinguished Professor of Animal Science, and Amy Bix, Associate Professor of History with an emphasis on science. And they were absolutely a team with me in planning every detail of this programming, in drafting a grant to support a good portion of it, the Humanities Iowa grant. In addition, thank you, Max, for bringing in additional funding to sponsor our scientists. We have two scientists, one a plant geneticist, another a medical, who are participating in dialogues with the humanities scholars that will be invited through November. So I'd like you to join me in applauding them for their hard work. Thank you. I have a number of sponsors to help as well. And, you can think of this as a boring list or a pretty exciting list given the mixed company. Humanities Iowa, as I mentioned, Center for Integrated Animal Genomics, Committee on Lectures, which, as you know, is funded by the government of the student body, Integrative Graduate Education and Research Traineeship, Interdepartmental Genetics Graduate Program, Phi Beta Kappa, Plant Science Institute, Program for Women in Science and Engineering, the College of Liberal Arts, which came up with some money to help us write the grant in the first place. Thank you very much, Mike. The Ames Public Library, with whom we've partnered on a lot of events. There are discussions of documentaries and books going on other nights, alternate nights with our speakers here. And finally, Monsanto. So many, many sponsors, and they're all helping to make this event possible. I have one brief announcement to make. When you address questions to the speaker after the lecture, would you please go to the mic so that everybody can hear? And also, would you give me just a moment before you ask your questions so that I can present our speaker with a plaque in honor of his selection as this year's Distinguished Scholar. We want him to take away a bit of a memento of the occasion. And now, a few words about our title and our concept. The title comes from Matt Ridley's book, Genome, the autobiography of a species in 23 chapters. This book is, in part, a primer for the non-scientist on the human genome, a rough draft of which was completed in 2000. Ridley says, quote, "I genuinely believe that we are living through the greatest intellectual moment in history, bar none." He asks readers to imagine that the genome is a book. The term blueprint, he says, is not accurate. Indeed, he argues that the idea of the genome as a book is not, strictly speaking, even a metaphor. It is literally true. Well, as an English professor, I was really pleased that he was writing in some language that I could comprehend, because that was one of the concerns that I had when working with Max. Would he understand us? Would we understand him? And other scientists as well. And I think we've been doing pretty well on that. And I think that it's important that we communicate in this way. And by we, I mean not just across the disciplines, but citizens in this democracy, that because we need, at least in my view, a rudimentary knowledge of genomic sciences and technologies to understand both its promises, which are dazzling, but also perils. And to achieve this understanding, we need to be attentive to scientists, of course, but also to artists, historians, and cultural critics. I'm thinking of, for example, some of our great novelists, such as Margaret Atwood, a book Oryx and Crake, which looks at global warming as well as genomic sciences and so on in a kind of speculative way. Or cultural critics, the public scholar Bill McKibben has written a book about genomics. It's definitely not an anti-science book, but he's saying, when is enough enough? Where do we draw the line? So we have many important questions to reflect upon, and the series brings together the next lecture will be following this by a woman from Duke who's an expert on depictions of genomic research and technologies in pop culture. We will then have a discussion of genetically altered foods, the politics and all of that, and then finally a symposium in November on medical ethics. So it's a very important lineup. Well, of course, the whole question of designing human beings and how far we should go with this has a history. And fortunately, we have an historian on hand who can help us with that question. So if I can now call on Amy Bix to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. And before I do introduce Hamilton, I do want to thank Brenda for pouring her heart and soul and energy into developing this whole fabulous series that we've been working on for so many months now and looking forward to for so many months. So thank you, Brenda. And now, it's my great pleasure and an honor to introduce my very good colleague, Hamilton Cravens. To do a thorough introduction would take more time than you probably want to give me, so I'll try and sum up an extremely distinguished record relatively rapidly. Hamilton's current position as the Distinguished Scholar for the Center for Excellence in Arts and the Humanities is only the latest of a very long list of honors. Not in order, Hamilton's been a fellow with the Ford Foundation, he's been a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center, at the Hoover Institution, he's held 3 Fulbrights in Germany and the Netherlands, he's held grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation, perfect example of bridging 2 cultures the way our series is trying to do. He's the author and editor of too many books for me to run through the list here, but conveniently we have some of them over on the table over there. I'll mention just some of the high spots. His book, The Triumph of Evolution on American Scientists and the Heredity Environment Controversy. His book, Before Head Start, which I think we have over there, about the Iowa Station and America's children. His book on technical knowledge and American culture. Another book on healthcare policy in contemporary America. And yet another one on the social sciences go to Washington, about the politics of knowledge in the postmodern era. Hamilton is currently working on a number of yet more books, most notably A History of the Social and Behavioral Sciences in America, another book on the changing notions of race, and a primer on the history of the social sciences. Hamilton's got more than 60 articles, going on 100 papers and comments. Don't worry, I'm not even going to begin to list those. And he currently serves on the editorial board of not one but 2 journals, the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth and the journal ISIS of the History of Science. It's with the history of science, of course, that Hamilton brings his expertise to us tonight. As Brenda told you so eloquently, our whole series this fall is going to be on the Book of Life on a Genomic Age, exploring the nature of life, the nature of humanity, the promises and the risks in trying to work with that in terms of biotechnology. Hamilton is here to give us the history about long, ongoing thoughts about how to redesign human nature with scientific support and support from other groups. And that really is the perfect lead-in to our talk about redoing human nature through genetic engineering. So without further ado, I give you my good colleague in the History of Technology and Science program and the History Department here at Iowa State, Hamilton Cravens.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for coming this evening. I'd like to thank the Center for Excellence in Arts and Humanities for my fellowship, as for my appointment as Distinguished Scholar in Arts and Humanities. I'd like to thank my department chairs who nominated me, Andre Plotkin over there, and who supervised me, Charlie Dobbs sitting in the back, who facilitated this great honor. This honor provided a semester's research leave, which, when combined with another semester's research leave from the Netherlands, gave me the time to turn the book that I've been struggling with on the social behavioral sciences history into a presentable draft for a publisher. Writing a book is not like writing a bunch of articles. It's much more demanding and much more difficult. And what we need when we do this sort of a project is uninterrupted time. And I can't say how precious that time has been. So I won't. But believe me, it was worth its weight in cut diamonds from Holland. So, thank you all very much, and thank you all very much for being here. I'm truly honored. Why should we care about the social sciences? We might as well ask why we should care about any of the domains of technical knowledge that our species has acquired in the last 2 centuries or so. For these bodies of technical knowledge, science, technology, medicine, have helped propel us into the secular modern age in which we live. The social sciences have always been about us, our politics, our social conventions, our impulses, our motives, our ideas and attitudes, our past, our present, and our future. And indeed, about the very structures and processes of whatever human nature has been and is. And the point of my talk is that the social sciences have been crucial because of their rich history and heritage that has been related to our hopes, our fears, and our surmises, and indeed they have some relationship to the current interest in genomics and in human engineering. The social sciences, well, it's one of those. Can you still hear me? Okay. The social sciences arose out of certain historical circumstances of the 18th century. One was the 18th century Enlightenment, that broad and complex movement of ideas and ideologies that's swept over much of the old world of Europe and much of the New World as well. The Atlantic civilization of that time. At bottom, the Enlightenment was a series of propositions concerning man's rationality and his ability to understand and to interpret the laws of nature and of society. The men of the 17th century scientific revolution, Galileo, Kepler, Harvey, Descartes, Newton, Hobbes, and Locke, among others, promoted in their own distinctive ways the idea that the laws of nature were universal and could be explained with the precision of advanced mathematics. The men of the 18th century Enlightenment, who carried forth these ideas and applied them to society more specifically, including Voltaire, Montesquieu, Linnaeus, Buffon, and that founder of political economy, Adam Smith, whose The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, was the social and economic manifesto of the Enlightenment, at least so far as I'm concerned. Smith presented a rational blueprint of the modern society and its economy. He began in his treatise with a historical account of the rise of the division of labor, that fundamental question of modern times and economy. He then analyzed at great length how and why markets have set prices and distributed resources, thus establishing the 2 main concerns of political economy for a century or more: value and distribution. Value of products and their distribution of resources and products. With his brilliant description of an impersonal market economy, a new way of conceptualizing human existence had been created. Hence, the larger point is the Enlightenment created the possibility of a science of society, of social science. The second, no less important event or series of events was the democratic revolution of the last half of the 18th century and the first third of the 19th century. This democratic revolution convulsed and engulfed the entire Atlantic world of that time. From the plains of eastern Prussia to the mountains of Appalachia, which is quite a stretch. And throughout the New World, clearly the American Revolution of 1776, with its cry of all men are created equal, and the French Revolution of 1789, with its notions of liberté, equality, fraternity, were the most conspicuous fruits of this political tidal wave, but it also swept over the British Isles, the German-speaking states, Belgium, Italy, even the Iberian Peninsula, and on to its colonial possessions in the New World. It is important to understand that the democratic revolution came about because of the collapse of the Society of Orders. That medieval Society of Orders in large parts of Europe, and to a lesser extent in the American colonies, the traditional triad of medieval society, those who worked, those who prayed, those who fought, was pretty much in tatters by the mid-18th century. As Professor Gordon Wood of Brown University put it in one of his most exciting books, which I've assigned to my students who are here tonight, and those who aren't, the aristocracy in the 18th century English colonies of North America were not really living in a replication of English society, but something more like a Hollywood movie set of that phenomenon. And so it went. That is the Society of Orders. The larger point is the democratic revolution created a demand for a science of society, of social science. So let's turn now to the American scene. And what I'm going to do in the next 25 or 30 minutes is talk about three different eras in American history and how those influenced social science, and how those led to this interest in human nature, because with the collapse of the Society of Orders and with the creation of a democratic revolution, by whatever criteria one wishes to use, but certainly by an 18th and early 19th century definition, it was democratic. How do you control human behavior? How do you establish order? How do you predict behavior? If you don't have this hierarchy, do you have chaos? In the first several decades of the 19th century, the life or natural sciences gave many indications that it was possible to understand human behavior. Now, this was an understanding of human behavior from the outside, looking in, looking at beings and saying, oh, well, they do that, therefore their nature is thus. But there were several of these, and they were taken as real science at the time. The Lamarckian idea of the inheritance of acquired characters and use and disuse, which meant that adaptations, habits, if you will, that an individual acquired during his lifetime, it was always his, never her lifetime, in the discourse of the time, were passed on to the offspring, and this idea achieved quite a wide acceptance. Thus, culture and nature worked together. 2, the phenomenal growth, popular and elite, of phrenology, the bumps in the head, which indicate different mental faculties. Lots of people believe this. Otto von Bismarck, Gesundheit, Queen Victoria. Mark Twain was a little skeptical, but then he was a smart fella. All kinds of people. 3, certain advances in the sciences of neurology and physiology, which portrayed a nervous system which conducted mental life and preserved it and made it happen. Conduct thus had a biological basis. 4, Darwin's theory of evolution, the so-called tree of life, meaning the interconnectedness of all living things, the descent of the contemporary species from pre-existing and usually extinct species. Because you know what happens to a species? It comes to an end. That's true of us, too. We will come to an end, too, but not tomorrow. 5, along with Darwin's theory of evolution, went his theory of the evolution of mind. So you have a connection between the evolution of body and the evolution of mind. And the evolution of mind goes from the lowliest animals, the intelligent cockroach, to the smart horse, to us. Sitting at the top of this pyramid or this chain of mental life. And all the way through, you can see in mankind and the other species examples and residues of behavior in the lower animals. Instincts, reflexes, tropisms, behavior patterns of all kinds, even rituals. It's perhaps forgotten that Darwin's Descent of Man, published in 1871, was really one of the first books in what you could call ethology, the evolution of behavior. Although I think he was a better scientist than those who in the 20th century became ethologists, but that's another story. The democratic movement of the early 19th century, which had caused such an institutional and ideological change from the revolution forward, took a new turn in the 1830s and 40s. And this shift is important because down to the 1830s, American society was based on the idea of the rational individual. That's not to say it necessarily worked that way. That's to say that everybody who wrote anything thought it did. There's a difference between the two. A simple illustration is the idea of the Incorporation Charter, which in the 1780s moved away from the old colonial and royal idea of a charter to an independent corporation in which the function of the corporation was to do one thing. The corporation was an individual. Okay. Now, in the 1830s and 40s, the idea of the corporation changed. It's a long, complicated story and kind of messy, so I won't go into it here. But suffice it to say that the legal revolution was to say that now the corporation could do a variety of things. So there's a kind of a nice irony in that just as Jacksonian democracy, quote unquote, was hitting high tide, this change in corporation laws allowed a small number of men to control more and more property and become millionaires. But hey, life is complex. What are some examples of social science through habit formation in these years, between the 1830s and the 1870s? Well, there's any number of them, and I'm just going to enumerate a few, and then I'm going to go on the next year and then the next year and just sort of enumerate examples, and then we're going to be done except for Q&A. So hang on. The public school began in the early 19th century as a district school, ungraded, in which pupils of various ages received individualized instruction in which they memorized pages in a book and recited that to the teacher, and when they finished the book, they went on to the next book. So you could have somebody who was 19 years old with the same assignments as somebody who was 12 years old. No gradation, no sense of belonging to a group. The public schools, starting in the 1830s and 40s, mainly in the northern states, had a graded curriculum. The argument was that children belong in age groups. They think differently when they're 12 years old than when they're 9 years old, and so on and so forth. And so it's important to provide mental training and the ability of being able to do things in a useful way. And the way to train them was by teaching them correct habits. And those habits would form personality. Or as William James was to put it at the end of the century, the forming of habits is like a kind of digging of a neurological canal. And after a while, you have a pathway, you have a habit, and you do it. Whether it's smoking a cigarette or, well, never mind. 2, another example was the penitentiary, which was an American invention, just like the public school was in the way in which I've talked about it here. Here again, rigid habit formation. Here again, the idea was that, first of all, the criminal was put in a cell by himself with a Bible. Sometimes he was chained to the wall, sometimes he wasn't. Anyway, he was supposed to be in his cell most of the day and most of the night being penitent, learning penance, learning how to understand his evil ways and correct them and read the Bible. And then when it came time for meals or exercise, they were all marched out into the corridor, put in ball and chains, and marched lockstep out to the meal table or to the exercise yard or whatever, and then marched back. Again, habit formation. 3, the insane asylum. To cure so-called nervous and mental diseases with something called moral therapy. Moral therapy was well known on both sides of the Atlantic, and this again was habit formation. If your family thought you were in need of this help, you were checked into an asylum, and if you were lucky, it was a private asylum with a good ratio of attendants and doctors to patients. If you weren't so lucky, it was another story. Here, the idea was to take someone with a ravaged psyche and teach them, slowly but surely, constructive habits of living, from making the bed, cleaning their clothes, sweeping up their room, to helping prepare meals, to playing games, to going on field trips, working with their fellows, so on and so forth. Again, building proper habits, rebuilding the personality. 4, there was also, and this was a very small movement, an attempt by a French physician who emigrated to the United States after the Revolution of 1848, Edouard Séguin. You can see that my French pronunciation's informed by my German accent, such as it is. Sorry about that. What he devised was a complex, elaborate series of physiological exercises by which groups of retarded people would be put into exercises, and through minute gradations, they would learn constructive habits. So, you got the public school with a group, you got the penitentiary with a group, you got the insane asylum with a group, you've got what chartered as a group, and it's all about habit formation. Political economy and the law. These two social sciences became the rule and forces of American enterprise, but both became adjusted to dynamic American capitalism after 1830. Political economy shifted from Adam Smith's highly individualistic model of society to a model in which you have competing economic interests, which compete with one another, and one devours the other, they eat each other's lunches and things like that. The norm was competition among groups, whether they're equal in fact or not, and the rules assumed that they were legally and morally equal. And finally, as a final example, there's many more, there was the new physical anthropology of the 1840s and 50s, in which the attempt was made to collect the skulls of the members of different races, measure the cranial capacity, assuming that the cranial capacity equaled mental power. It's a perfectly reasonable assumption for the time. I mean, we can snicker about it today if we want to, and fair enough if you want to, but that's what people really thought. So there you are. Now, perhaps the symbol of the time was the democratic norm. It's in the 1830s and the 1840s, for reasons that are still unclear, that we find on both sides of the Atlantic people suddenly talking about norms or averages, a democratic norm. And the symbol of this comes with Adolphe Quetelet's The Average Man, published in 1840. And the idea here was uniformity to standards. And you have a line going through society, A prime, like this, and you have variations of certain distances from that line, but everyone is related to everyone else. Everyone conforms to the same norm. The 8 decades or so following the 1860s may be thought of as constituting a different era in American history. If this first era of American history, Americans thought that a person's reputation, what was the key to the person's status, or his character was the key to his status. From the 1870s to the 1950s, the argument was that the key to a person's status or power was his or her own ability, or lack thereof. Thus, the interest now was to take that line, A prime, which was horizontal, and make it vertical, like a pyramid. And as I like to tell my students, it's the Pharaohic period of American history. It's the pyramid-building era of American history. And in fact, it's a concern with differentness, not sameness. It's a concern with variation, as in the statistics of Francis Galton and Carl Pearson. And it's an interest, furthermore, in how you differentiate, how you make distinctions, how you segregate. The perfect image of the new way of looking at things came from the brilliant, marvelous computing machine of that 19-year-old German engineer, Hermann Hollerith. His computing machine, which was able, through a variety of mechanical and electrical functions, to record for any person for whom there was a punch card an n number of variables. As many as you wanted, as many as you could get on the card. Thus, you could have cross-tabulations on XY axes. Thus, you could sort out the characteristics of all kinds of populations and subgroups. Again, it's all about groups. And 3 interrelated changes came to social science in these years. 1, social science dissipated as a unified intellectual construct and became the variegated social sciences. This is actually something that happened to the sciences and engineering generally, splintering from unified disciplines to many different disciplines. And something that happens in Europe as well as America. Is this the same thing? It just happens a little differently in Germany than it does in England or France or the United States. But you look at it by 1900, and a lot of changes taken place. There's a proliferation of disciplines which went with the notion that special knowledge by an expert in a defined field was the person to look to. It's the age of the expert, the age of the professional. It's the age of hierarchy, because it's the expert who's up there. Of course, the expert got involved in all kinds of battles with the businessman. That's another story, which I can't get into tonight. 2, the social sciences moved, at least in part, in the new and reformed university academic culture. Social scientists became, over 2 generations, increasingly academic professionals, not independent gentlemen or traditional professionals, lawyers, doctors, architects, etc., 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 and became subject to the mores and folkways of academic culture. The social sciences, furthermore, 3, became more oriented to behavioral approaches. Particularly after about 1900 or 1920, it became possible to project how organisms behaved. They began with simple organisms in places like Woods Hole, Massachusetts, with marine animals. And once they were able to show, hey, we can do this, then you find people playing around with the chimpanzees, like John B. Watson, trying to figure out how to make them behave. And finally, you have this interest in behavior, meaning with behavior you can measure and you can experiment. You still can't get inside the organism, but you can see how it works. You no longer have to speculate, like Herbert Spencer, poor old Herbert Spencer. Now you could actually put the cat in the maze, or the rat in the maze, or the kid in the maze, and see what the kid does, or the rat, or the cat, with the hat, to quote Dr. Seuss. What were some examples of social and behavioral sciences in the age of expertise? Well, mental testing, I think, comes to the top of the list, at least in my book. And especially intelligence testing must stand at the top. The most famous or most notorious, depending on your point of view and what discipline you happen to belong to, would be the Army intelligence tests in World War I, which were interpreted, I would say, misinterpreted widely at first as evidence that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and black folks were just not as smart as whites who had been born in this country or immigrants who'd been in this country for a long period of time. It was pointed out by the mid-1920s by such intellects as Walter Lippmann that the test scores had been badly misinterpreted, that too much emphasis had been placed upon a genetic and racial basis, again, using heredity as a causal explanation. By the 1930s, that kind of group racial argument was gone until the 1970s, but that's another story. 2, national income analysis, which such economists as Wesley Clair Mitchell, pioneered in the 1920s and 30s, sought to measure all economic behavior in the economy in all sectors to show the dimensions and proportions and totalities of pecuniary activity. And there's a large industry of national income analysis, which becomes in the 30s and 40s something that's called macroeconomics. 3, social psychology, particularly of 2 varieties. One was social learning theory, as promoted and championed by a group of behavior psychologists at Yale's Institute of Human Behavior, or Human Relations, in the 30s and 40s, which was an attempt to develop axiomatic and deductive methods of explaining human behavior. If you can't get inside the organism, you can look at what it does and then project mathematical axioms about what it does. See that? That's science. Or group dynamics, the other version, as developed by the German Gestalt psychologist Kurt Lewin and his associates at the Iowa Child Welfare Research Station in the 1930s and later on at MIT and Michigan later on. 4th example was cultural anthropology, especially as promoted by Franz Boas and his associates at Columbia University. Cultural anthropology was based upon the analysis of groups, just like social psychology was, national income analysis, and mental testing of all kinds. Election analysis, practiced in the 1930s and 20s by political scientists, which was pretty much pure quantification, but it was an attempt to measure political behavior. Why did you vote for this Democrat? Why did you vote for this Republican? Why did you do this and why did you do that? It was polling, but surveying, that sort of thing. Related to this was the idea that somehow you were probing latent attitudes. That if you could figure out why steel workers voted for Roosevelt and hated blacks, you were onto something, whatever that was. So that you could then isolate these people out again and divine other assumptions and other conclusions. Related to this also, 6, was public opinion polling. And here, it's again a debate over what kind of groups you sample. the election of 1936 came along, and as you may or may not know, the Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon would win in a landslide. George Gallup came along. Gallup was an Iowan, you know. Yep. George Gallup came along, but instead of just polling people who had telephone numbers and car registrations, who were largely Republicans, because they had the money, he and his workers made sure they sampled members of every economic group, and they predicted a Democratic landslide. There was an old saying in American politics before the election of 36 that as Maine goes, so goes the nation. And when the election returns came in, Maine went for Landon. Then Vermont went for Landon. And Democrats began to get nervous. And then the rest of the nation went for Roosevelt. And so the new saying was, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. Had to have at least one joke in this. Another example of this kind of social science was the community study, which was done by sociologists primarily. Middletown being the most famous, but also Black Metropolis, Street Corner Society, and American Dilemma, Caste and Class in a Southern Town, among many others. In fact, I teach a course now and then, a graduate course in which we talk about the history of the times through these studies, which is a good way of doing it. And another example is the social survey, which had by the 1930s an honorable history, mainly first done by women social workers, friendly visitors, as they were called. And social surveys were done in the United States and Europe, both, principally in England and Germany and the continent, but elsewhere. And the idea was to catalog and inventory the problems of the poor and the downtrodden, and try to figure out what to do about the poor and the downtrodden. Okay, moving right along. We live in an age of individuation and fragmentation, of a world of n or infinite dimensions, of the perception that one can imagine any number of factors that one wishes in a situation depending upon one's perspective. To a considerable extent, this world of individualism and fragmentation means that in many situations, what matters is individual choice. And that the unit of society is the individual, not the group, the race, the family, the community, the nation, or the what have you. And the model is of rational choice, because you can't have anything else but rational choice if you have individuals, right? They must be rational. Otherwise, ye gods, right? And you don't want the ye gods. That would be too much. This has important implications for science and scholarship, to the extent that science and scholarship depend upon a generalized authority and expertise. It's called peer review in some circles, but it's really a collective judgment, a collective authority. And upon a world in which things may be characterized by universal criteria, how can anything be universal if the world is so fragmented and individuated? Doesn't the we become the I, and there's chaos? There's a lack of order. How can you have laws of economics if you don't have any regular behavior? As Professor Mary Morgan of the University of London put it in a brilliant talk a couple of years ago. What I would like to do here is talk about some examples of how social sciences coped with the postmodern era, which I would date more or less from the 1940s. Some people argue it's the 1950s, other people call it the 1930s. I'll split the difference. 1940s, because I'm a cultural historian, I don't depend upon elections and specific dates. The 1940s is fine. And in fact, what we find in every case is that social science is not based on the group or a collective entity, but upon the individual. And if you stop and think about that, it's ubiquitous in our popular culture as well. 1. There emerges in the 1930s and 40s and 50s a general systems model of insurgency and how to counter it. Here, Project Camelot, which was an attempt to divine the causes of insurgency and Marxist revolutions and how to counter them, which was specifically focused, or about to be focused, on Chile until it was exposed, is a prime example. But that was one of about 50 such projects the Department of Defense was running around the world in the 1960s. Only Project Camelot got canceled because it got into trouble in public relations. This, in turn, comes initially from the psychological school that says frustration leads to aggression. This is the social learning school, which led in turn to studies of national character by such anthropologists as Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, who argue that there was a relationship between culture and personality, thus connecting the individual to the larger culture. Thus, you could connect studies of individuals, as in elites, members of elites, and say, well, they had lousy training as children and they turned out to be monsters. William Langer's description, analysis of Adolf Hitler reads that way, that he did for the OSS. Perfectly good science at the time, etc., etc., etc. I've met people of places like GW in the district who practice what's called political psychology, which is a more modern version of this. So that if you have a culture that warps people, Erik Erikson talking about Luther to Hitler, remember that? Maybe you don't know, but Erik Erikson talking about how the German character led right to Hitler from Luther. And if you could only retrain those people, denazify them, which is what we did after World War II for a while, they turn out to be all right. The next generation. The idea was to cure the sick patient being Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union, whomever you choose to pick, or perhaps that group of Marxist revolutionaries in, say, Bolivia or whatever, or that naughty boy, Che Guevara. 2, you have the rise of neoclassical economics, which began to gain the upper hand among American economists for the first time in the 1940s. First and foremost at the University of Chicago. That's a long, complicated development, which I can't go into here in any kind of detail because we'd be here till 3 in the morning, and I'm not doing that, and I don't think you are either, because we're almost done here. With such personages as George Stigler and Milton Friedman. Stigler was a particularly brilliant economist. Friedman was a particularly brilliant publicist. Neoclassical economists were able to insist that the fundamental action in the economy was in the market, and that it was through the analysis of individual markets and individual buyers and sellers that the action occurred. And that's what was relevant. Macroeconomics